Sorry, so the first thing I thought I might do is just give you, for those of you who haven't been to Australia, just give you a bit of an idea of where it is and how large it is. It's over just to the east of Asia, and between Asia and New Zealand. Fairly large country, it's sixth largest in the world, not as large as the US and Canada. About 4,000 kilometres across, 3,700 north to south. Excuse me. For such a large place, it's got a very small population of only just approaching 23 million at the moment, predominantly living around the coastline and most of those living on the east coast. Our government structure is very similar to Canada's. We've got a Commonwealth government, federal government as it's referred to, but we've got a Commonwealth government that sits across the top, and then each of the 6 states and 2 territories have their own governments, and they are completely self-governing. As far as emergency management goes, the Commonwealth Government has no legislated mandate in emergency management in Australia, so their interest is trying to get national consistency across a whole range of areas, and to do that, they effectively come to the table with a big bucket of money, and they buy that consistency and that cooperation, and try to get national consistency in some areas. But other than that, they really don't have a significant role to play. The only element of the Commonwealth that's really engaged regularly or semi-regularly in emergency management is our Defence Force, and that's only in a support sense. So when they do come to a state or a territory, they fall in underneath the state territory arrangements, and they just provide support functions there. That darker green area at the bottom is the state of Victoria, with the red dot in the middle of it. The red dot is just pointing to where Melbourne is. Again, it's a fairly small area. It's about the size of the British Isles. 5 million people for population out of the 23 million that are in Australia. Around about 70% of those live in the city or the inner or the outer suburbs, and then the remaining 30% are spread throughout some regional cities in the state. So again, it's not a large population, and it's Victoria is one of the 3 most bushfire-prone areas in the world, along with Southern California and the south of France. So, as I said, there are a couple of key drivers for our reform, and a couple of specific incidents that caused some real big problems for us. And one of them, some of you may well have followed some of it on the TV when it was happening in February 2009. What's now referred to as the Black Saturday bushfires. The difference between these fires, and I'll show you a table shortly that gives you a bit of an idea of fire history in Victoria, but the difference between these fires and the ones that we usually suffer every year, which can be very, very significant, was that they happened in the urban fringe area. So rather than right out in the hills, these happened right on the outskirts of the city, and therefore, whilst it's very heavily populated with bushland, there's also lots of small hamlets and townships that are actually sitting within the area that was affected by this. The result of that fire on February the 7th was that we had 173 people killed, more than 500 injured, over 2,000 homes destroyed, 4,000 people displaced, and quite a number of those still not back on their own housing block, or their properties still haven't been rebuilt in some cases, and an economic impact somewhere in the vicinity of $4.4 billion, which is very significant for a small state like Victoria. The outcome of that event, even well before it finished, was that our state premier realised that this was something that the population of Victoria was not going to just sit back and accept as being another bad day, and that we would get on with business once it was finished. And as a result of that, he announced during the middle of the event that he would be calling for a Royal Commission, which is the highest level of inquiry that we can have in Australia. As a result of that, we had a Royal Commission that was held between April 2009 and July 2010, and a whole range of recommendations came out of that, some of which I'll talk to you about shortly. Just not long after that Royal Commission ended, we had another very big event in the state, this time significant flooding. So we went from 18 months before having the worst bushfires in Australian history to 18 months later having the worst flooding in Victorian history, where some 2/3 of the state were affected by that. Over nearly 4,000 homes affected, hundreds of arterial roads, and nearly 3,000 local roads, and you can imagine the rail bridges, etc., and another significant economic impact of somewhere in the vicinity of $1.8 billion. Both of these events occurred towards the back end of what had been one of the longest droughts in our history. Victoria had been in drought from 1995 We had the fires in 2009, the floods in 2010-11, and then the drought was finally declared broken in 2012. So these flooding events were effectively the start of the finish of the drought, but 17 years of drought was quite significant. As a result of this event, and again because of the large impact on the community, the government decided that they would have another inquiry, but not at the Royal Commission level. So they asked the former Chief Commissioner of our State Police Force to conduct an inquiry into the floods, and a number of recommendations came from that as well. This next slide just gives you a little bit of an idea of the history of fire that we have in Victoria. Now we have bushfires or wildfires, as many of you will call them, every summer. These are the ones that are probably of slightly greater significance. They're either fires that have seen significant areas of land destroyed, significant numbers of people killed, or a combination of both. The reason those three areas are coloured there, the 13th of January 1939, is that after that event, there was a Royal Commission held into that one, and it was at that time that that legislation came into place following that inquiry, where we actually had fire agencies identified and given legal responsibility for managing public land and private land. So we had two large fire agencies in the state that were given the responsibility of looking after those two things. So that was effectively the start of our formal emergency service era, I suppose you'd say, following those fires. 16th of February 1983, Ash Wednesday, was another significant date, because it killed a lot of people again, and that's only the Victorian figures. There were other numbers in South Australia and our neighbouring state, another 30 or 40 odd people, 35 I think, killed in South Australia as well. And as a result of that one, we, for the first time, saw emergency management legislation put in place by government. So right up until 1983, we had legislation from 1939 that actually identified fire services and gave them accountability and responsibility for particular events, but we had no overarching emergency management legislation. As a result of 1983, the emergency management legislation came into place. And that's where, for me, not the trouble started, but I mean, it's where we became a little complacent. As a result of having that legislation, as you can imagine, it impacts on a whole range of things. It prescribes government structures, it prescribes responsibility to all sorts of agencies, it prescribes that you have to have emergency management plans at the various levels, and so on and so on and so on. So it's a legislation being very prescriptive. All of those things that we hadn't seen before. As a result of that legislation being there, we went through the process of actually implementing all of the requirements of meeting the obligations in it. And then in effect, other than every few years giving it a bit of a tweak, the legislation stayed as it was. And as a result of the fact that even though we still have some fairly large fires, but with very small numbers of fatalities associated with them, in effect, we almost, I think, became so complacent that we believed that everything was still great. The reality is that every year after 1983 that we were responding to these events, other than the few years where we gave a little bit of tweaking to it, we were effectively responding to an event that was however many years back to 83. So if it was 1993, we were effectively responding back to a 1983 event, because we were responding in exactly the same way we had done 10 years before, without any consideration of how the environment had changed, how demography had changed, how anything had changed. So we were sitting back, big, fat and happy, and thought everything was cruising along. And then, of course, we get to February 2009, and if you look at that table, you'll see that the actual area burnt was relatively small compared to some of the other bigger fires that we've had over the decades. But of course, because it occurred where it did, as I said, on the urban fringe, then the number of people that were affected by that was significant. And that's when, as I said, the Royal Commission kicked in, and it recognised, and we recognised, that we actually had some problems with the way that we were functioning as a system and as a state.
I have one question.
Yes, certainly.
In Canada, our insurance policies say if it's a fire, it's covered, that's private.
Yep.
And the private industry will pay for the house and put it back exactly the same spot. In Australia, are these covered by the private industry, insurance industry, or is this wildfire is different? You've got legislation and it's considered non-insurable.
You can get bushfire insurance, and most companies provide that. So you will go out and buy your own private insurance policy, and that will be covered in there. So if your house is destroyed by bushfire, then you'll be covered for it. The only time that industry has a part to play, and as it turns out, the the February 2009 fires, the two fires that I'll talk to you about in a minute and show you some of the footage of, were actually caused by power companies' above-ground power lines clashing. And as a result of that, they've only just settled 2 or 3 class actions where those companies are actually liable for compensation in relation to those fires, over and above any insurance payout that someone would have had through their private insurance.
Yep. Do you know offhand whether there is any subrogation in that class action? Because normally what happens is the insurer will pay, and then they'll start looking around for who really caused it, and then that would be this group. So did the subrogation get in the class action?
No, they had to wait right the way through to the very end until it was said that it's this company and they are the responsible and therefore they pay. So up until that time, other than any insurance that the individual might have had, there was nothing.
So you got the insurance. If you had insurance, you got insurance and the settlement.
No, if you had insurance, you'd get your insurance payout, and then once you got your class action payout, once that was done, there'd be however that's reconciled behind the scenes. I don't know, but there's no double dipping.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And Tony, in Canada, if you're talking about a home rather than a vacation property or something, 95% of the homes in Canada would have urban fire and wildfire insurance in place. In Australia, is insurance something that most people would have for brush fire?
Yeah, the majority. Look, a lot of people do. It became one of the problems for the state, of course, is that a lot of people don't, and they deliberately don't. And a lot of the people that live out in these areas are actually they're hippies, and when I say hippies, I'm not trying to be derogatory, but they're not people that are getting up at 7 in the morning, going to work in an office and coming back again. They tend to live out there and they live off their blocks and grow vegetables and things like that. And they don't. A lot of them tend not to insure. A lot of them believe that it'll never happen to them, so they don't worry about it. Others believe, well, if it does happen, then someone's going to look after me anyway. So that's it.
And in Canada, because 95, 98% have private insurance, if the other 2 or 5%, this small number in Canada, say, I had no insurance. If they went to the government and said, would you help me out? The government says no. You had a choice and you chose not to.
Yeah, they don't. When I say the government helps them out, people believe the government will help them out. They help them out significantly with regards to welfare payments and those sorts of things, and there are disaster grants that they will get the same as everybody else will get. But it's nothing like the sort of money you would need to put another property up or anything like this. It's almost to allow you to leave immediately whilst you then re-establish yourself. So if you don't have insurance, at the end of the day, you pretty well suffer the consequences of not having that. And in Australia, it's the same. Most people have insurance. Most people have it, but a lot of people deliberately don't. The other thing that happens, and I'm not sure what it's like here, or in the US, but in Australia, and I'm sure it is the same, when something happens, everybody comes together. So therefore, you get millions and millions and millions of dollars thrown at these sorts of things and donations of everything you can imagine. And these people know that that's going to come. So therefore, they have a huge amount of stuff given to them anyway. They're the recipients of the public donations in the same way as they are the grants and so on from the government. And for a lot of them, as I said, they will sort of re-establish by just going out and buying a very cheap caravan. or RV or whatever you call it, and trailer, yeah, exactly, just a very cheap trailer and just block it back on their block again. That's it. So, yeah. So there are problems with insurance, but most people do have it. This slide here is just to give you a bit of an idea of the build up to February the 7th. From 28th to the 30th of January, we had what was an exceptional heat wave for the state. It's unusual for us to get multiple days where we have temperatures to the sorts of extremes that you can see on there, but on this occasion,
I don't think there's a community in Canada that's experienced 40 degrees.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, you'll love the temperatures that are coming there. So, yeah, as I say, 3 consecutive days above 43 for the city of Melbourne, which was unheard of. I mean, we often have runs of days in the mid to high 30s through summer, but rarely do we get those sorts of temperatures consecutively. To the northwest of our state on the Murray River, which divides our state and New South Wales, the one above us, we have a regional city there called Mildura. They had 12 consecutive days in their city over 40 degrees. As you can imagine, that doesn't only have physical issues. That doesn't create physical issues. That creates a whole heap of other issues too, with people start to go a little bit crazy with it too. So it has, the police say it has impacts on crime. It has impacts on all sorts of things when you get these sorts of aberrant temperatures. For the first time in 2009, we actually deliberately looked at the mortality rates around the state of those that are considered to be at-risk groups, such as the elderly, the young, the infirm, and so on. And we're able to directly attribute an additional 374 deaths over the normal numbers that could be expected at that particular time of the year for those 3 days to the heat wave. So we hadn't actually measured that. We hadn't measured that before. So we've always had a situation where we've had people that get killed by fire, but we never take into account the numbers that actually die as a result of the heat wave itself. So for the first time we started measuring that, and for the first time we actually started reporting it to the community as well. Because what we've found over repeated numbers of years is people don't prepare themselves well just for the heat, let alone the potential that there might be a fire. And the other thing is that often a lot of people who succumb to the heat wave are elderly people and so on who succumb in their homes who can't afford to use the electricity to run air conditioning, or they hear government come on the radio and they say, you know, we've got a big surge in power use and need people to throttle back on the amount of power you're using. And because these are elderly people and they come from a time where they did the right thing by everybody, they turn their air conditioning off if they've got it anyway. And as a result of that, they then suffer the consequences of it. So we started to measure this and report this, and then also had a big public campaign with the community about knowing who your neighbour is, and if you know you've got elderly neighbours, checking on them, etc., etc., etc. And that was part of the purpose for that. But the interesting thing is, of course, as I said, it actually revealed to us that we could directly attribute that number of deaths to the heat wave over that 3-day period. On the 7th of February itself, the city of Melbourne reached 46.4 degrees. That's the highest temperature ever recorded in an Australian capital city. Now, we have temperatures higher than that outside of capital cities. We've had temperatures up in the low 50s in some areas, but that's the highest temperature ever recorded for a capital city. And for Melbourne, that's probably 4 degrees, 4.5 degrees above anything we've ever seen before. So a very, very significant day. And a place called Hopetown, which again was up near Mildura, on that day reached 48.8 degrees. Wind speeds on the day were recorded up to 115 kilometres an hour, and we had a relative humidity of 9%. So in Australia, and I'm sure it's probably the same for some of the US colleagues that might be on here. I know you're all Canadians on here, aren't you? There you go. So my apologies to you, Canadians. Sorry, for you guys too, I'm sure. Do you get, as far as your wildfires go, is that driven by any particular sort of a wind pattern or anything?
Absolutely.
It is. So where do yours come from?
Again, some is generated by the fire itself.
Yeah, that's right. Which,
Anyway.
So for us, they're predominantly northerly winds. So in summer, in January, February, in Victoria, our wind patterns are predominantly from the north, which means they're coming down through the middle of the country, through the desert, and then they're coming down. And as they come down, those winds they're driven by these very strong winds. And of course, when you've got that sort of an issue, then you generally have very low humidity. And we call that a perfect storm for us. And we get, once or twice a year we will get that anyway. But on this particular occasion, with those temperatures, that wind speed and that humidity, and as Paul said, the fire itself then creates its own weather pattern, which you'll see shortly. That created a day that we knew we were going to have a lot of problems. Interestingly, our Premier and our heads of agencies had been on the radio, the television, and in the print media for a week before saying to Victorians, there is a very, very bad time coming. Now, this hadn't happened before, but the Bureau of Meteorology has got to a stage in Australia, and I'm sure yours are pretty good too, where they are able to predict things very, very well now. And the weather patterns that they were predicting, the government said if they actually eventuate, we know we've got a real big problem. So there was a lot of communication with our communities leading up to this particular day, and yet we still had the sorts of impacts that I've spoken about. The biggest problem on the day, I guess, was, as always happens in Victoria, again, I'm not sure if this is the same with you, but you have these bad days, you have fires running, and then at some stage, generally on the same day, we will get a wind change. And it's when we get that wind change that the real carnage actually occurs. Because, as I said, we are used to our fires burning from the north. If you see a fire on the horizon, or if you're told about a fire burning somewhere, and the northerly winds are blowing, you can tell where it's going to go, and if you happen to be in the path, but a lot of people have time to move away and get out of the way of it.
Do you have dangerous buildup of vegetation in your areas? Like here where they try to stop wildfires, and basically it's a natural part of the ecosystem. So you get this buildup of duff, sometimes higher in my head, and suddenly you can't stop it. Is that something happens in Australia?
Very specifically about that in a minute. What you can see on your screen now is a Google map, I guess, that has had what we call our Phoenix fire modelling system run over the top of it to simulate two of the very large fires that occurred on the 7th of February. Between the two of them, they took more than 100 of the lives of the 173. And I'll show you those in a minute. But when I actually play this simulation for you, what you're going to see is, and I've got the laser on, so I'm assuming the guys on the screen can see it. There's a town here called Kilmore. Just to the east of that, you'll see a fire break out in that area. And when you do, the fire will start moving down in the southeasterly direction, being driven by the winds from the northwest. So the fire will start here and start moving this way. A couple of hours, or some 3.5 hours after that fire starts, as it's moving down this way, the southerly wind change comes in, and instead of moving in that direction, all of a sudden it'll turn and it'll start to move that way. And at about exactly the same time, over here, you'll see another fire break out. So this fire up the top here is called the Kilmore East Fire. It was the first of the two really big ones in that area. And then the one that occurred over here was called the Murrindindi Fire, the second of the two. And eventually, as these fires started to move down, when the wind change came, they both joined and became one massive fire moving back up towards the northeast of the state. As you watch the fire moving down, particularly this first one, you'll notice there's lots and lots of red spots occurring on it, and that's simulating the spotting action of the fires. So when I talk about spotting, I'm not sure what you guys call it, but when I'm talking about spotting, that's the debris, the burning debris that's picked up at the head of the fire and blown ahead of it and starts more fires ahead. The conditions on the day were that bad that our spotting was occurring 22 kilometres ahead of the main fire front. And the reason it goes that far is because our forests are predominantly eucalypt forests, and eucalypts, if anyone's seen eucalypt trees, they're very thin, fine leaves, but they are absolutely full of eucalyptus oil. And once they catch fire, they don't just catch fire, burn out and drop to the ground. They catch fire and they burn for quite some time. And these leaves get up into the wind column and get driven by that fire. So we had fire spotting on the day occurring 22 kilometres ahead of the fire. First fire that you'll see as it's burning down to the southeast, the width of that fire head is approximately 5 kilometres, so it sounds a lot, but for some of our fires that's relatively small, but it's 5 kilometres wide. Once the wind change occurs and it turns, the eastern flank of the fire then becomes the head, and the fire front became 45 kilometres wide, and then carried on burning off through the bush and through the handles. And following this simulation that I'll show you now, there's a short video that I'm going to show you that gives you a bit of an idea of what that might look like if you happen to be in front of one of them.
And Tony, was there a sense for both of these fires? Was it lightning? Was it a campfire that got out of
No, these were both caused, as I said, by power line clashes. Ultimately, that's what we've found. So I'll just click inside here, and I'll stop it as we go along. I'll stop this a couple of times, so you can see the Kilmore fire there start up here. And at that stage, it's 12:50 now, so that's from 11:30 through till 12:50, that bit of spread there. If I stop it there, you'll see that fire now, as well as moving ahead the way it is, it started to move to the left. And that's as that wind change is starting to come through. That's about 2:50 in the afternoon. The wind change is starting to come through from the southwest. You see the Murrindindi fire has started over here. And you can see these red dots that I was talking about. That's over 20 kilometres from the fire, the main fire head, which is over here. And now you can see again how far ahead these fires are spotting of themselves with the southwesterly wind coming from behind, blowing them up from the northeast of the state. Just to give you a bit of an idea of scale, that's the city of Melbourne down there, that red dot. The actual size of the city is probably about 1.5 times the diameter again of that circle, so that's a whole city, the urban city area, which gives you a bit of a feel for how large these fires are. And as you can see, whilst that looks like it's very heavily vegetated country up here, it is. This is all urban fringe, so there are lots and lots of towns out here where are probably only 40 minutes drive into the city. That's about it. So it's not that far away at all.
This is all one afternoon.
This is all one afternoon, yeah. And where you're almost at now is 1 a.m. on the Sunday morning. So by the time we got to 1 a.m. on the Sunday morning, that fire front now is extending from here all the way around to here, and there's still spotting ahead over there. And if I just go back and play that again, it'll go through very quickly now for you and just be able to watch it unfold. But that started at 11:20 in the morning, and this is going through till 1 a.m. the next morning. The majority of those deaths, as I said, over 100 100 of them in that area, and there's a little area, stop it. 2 seconds and I'll stop this for you. It's down here where you can see this place, Hurstbridge. Just in this area here, there's a small town called St Andrews, which is relevant to the video that I'm about to show you. So I'll just play that simulation one more time. And just remember, as I said, St Andrews being just down in this area here.
This entire simulation, this is just a 14-hour period of time.
Yep. Those two fires, even though, as I say, even though the bulk of the damage, so the majority of the deaths that occurred in those fires occurred between 4:30 in the afternoon and about 8 in the evening. That's 3.5 hours. So that's when the fire front went through the bulk of the small towns that were there when people had to know. So that's when the bulk of the damage occurred. The fires itself weren't contained until I think a week. 20th of February or thereabouts, and were cleared out and sort of but that particular fire that you see there wasn't actually out. Declared fully out.
Very difficult to tell people to evacuate.
Well, yeah, it's a real problem in there.
If there's a fire.
Yeah. Now this, before I play this film that I'm about to show you, came from a documentary that's done by one of our TV stations following the fires. And the fellow in it, everyone likes his here. So the guy who's in it, his name is Jim Baruta. He actually filmed it on his mobile phone. They interviewed him and filmed it in the documentary. But to give you a bit of an idea of what the fire actually looked like, if you think about the sorts of businesses I was talking about, even the initial fire having a 5 floor with a head width on it, to get back to the stage where you're up to 40, 45 floors when approaching towns. And what you're about to see is exactly what one of those fires looks like. I hope you can hear it on the other end.
Safe enough to arm himself with nothing more than a video camera.
How safe can you be? I haven't got the truth on right now. So I thought I'd be fine. I'm like, no, it was not like that. You hear the noise, it sounds like trains or jets coming towards you at a distance. Louder and louder. The leaves, the heat, the oil, the leaves, the eucalyptus, they just, it's like gas coming on. It's just burning. The gases from the eucalyptus trees are escaping so quickly that they race upwards, mix with the air, and explode. The fire disappears. The flames 4 times the height of the 20 degrees. We'll get a bit of a fire tornado in a minute. I'll point to answer your place. And stuff was just a very hurricane. It wasn't a hurricane, but it's a fire. All this debris going everywhere. It was like all the down something was in the air flying around. The fire tornado ripping through tens of acres in seconds. At well beyond 1,000 degrees, it makes an up and burn. This firestorm can now kill 200 meters. There's no way you can change that, but that would be bad. It was like a apologise on the other end. Tracy came in and told me that microphone was too close, so I hope it didn't distort too much or deafen you or otherwise. That gives you a bit of a...
It's remarkable. I don't think about the sound of a fire. I'm thinking about the burning or whatever.
Well, and you can't actually pick up on that video what it sounds like. When he talks about it sounding like jet engines and so on, it actually does. It sounds like an aircraft, like a big commercial aircraft is actually swooping towards your house. It is that loud. And the fires do move that quickly. For those that know about fire behaviour, once it's onto an incline and starts climbing, it takes off at a rapid rate of knots. Yeah.
Now, when the fellow did the video, he escaped into his bunker.
Yep.
What would have been the design purpose of that bunker?
Well, that's become an issue in relation to post of the Royal Commission. Bunkers aren't, or until recent times, have not been accepted, endorsed ways of protecting yourself from fire. For the very reason that he was talking about, he was having problems breathing in the outside, so I went to the bunker. Well, going to the bunker wasn't going to help him with breathing because they're not built in a way that they've got their own self-contained air supply or otherwise. So the same issues that you've got outside are the same issues you're going to have inside. That wasn't a bunker in the true sense of a bunker. His house is built, as many of them are, on a slight incline in paddocks or fields or whatever you call them. We call them paddocks, just open pasture area, where he's cleared that, as you can see by the trees around it, built his house. And in order for his house to be level, then he's obviously got an area below it. It's not sitting flat on the ground, it's sitting elevated. And below that, anything underneath, what he's chosen to do, because he knows he lives in a fire-prone area, is actually put a steel door on rather than a timber door on one of those storage areas, and he just refers to it as his bunker. What they will do is protect you from radiant heat and so on, and allow you to shelter in there whilst the fire passes over, and then come out and start putting out your house and the things around your house. So that's predominantly what he would use it for. But bunkers themselves have only just been started to be implemented in Victoria, and the government's finding it's probably one of the worst roads that they went down, because there's still a lot of dispute about just how safe they are. A lot of people died in their own bunkers in Black Saturday after going there thinking they would be safe, and they were killed inside the bunkers. The government itself is having to invest a significant amount of money into the research and the development of these things. There's a company now or two companies now that are actually manufacturing bunkers, and the government had committed to providing some sort of subsidy for these things. But there's still a lot of dispute about whether they're good, bad, or otherwise for you. So
the thing they were talking about there interested me is they were talking about the eucalyptic oils being thrown into the sky and then igniting.
Yep.
That's actually the same principle as, the fuel air explosives.
Yeah.
Explosives, the daisy cutters that the Americans use.
Yep.
So essentially the whole
it's a natural version
of a bomb.
Yeah, it's a natural version of it. Yeah, exactly. So, as I said, after that fire, we had our Royal Commission, and they came up with 67 recommendations in all, and made quite a number of statements about a raft of things. But some of the statements were probably had greater significance than others, at least to those of us in the sector anyway. And the first one is one that where my office comes into it now, and I'll link this later on with the presentation. But they were saying there in effect that just by doing the same things over and over and over again, but doing them better, and doing them better by either putting more money into them or buying new versions of something or rewriting that particular plan in a certain way, was not going to deal with the issues that arose on Black Saturday. They also talked about the organisational structures and so on, which I'll talk to you what's changed there, because our whole legislation from 1983 had almost set us up.
The way you set up the stuff for me yesterday with the phone.
Ways rather than.
I don't have internet in Cordova. Can I do it there too?
The community right next to
How do I do it?
Recommended will happen. One of the things that we've had a problem with, and this is where my office comes into it again in the past, is that
I am on a
we have inquiries, recommendations get made, they get accepted by government. 18 months down the track, if you walk around all the agencies and say, track with those recommendations.
Yeah, whenever you have people with you, you're not nice to me.
Because there's nobody there actually monitoring.
No chips for you and no belly rub.
Three things were quite relevant.
No chips, no belly rub.
That's come about as a result of it.
Oh, she's not listening to you.
As I said, we had the floods that had occurred as well, and the inquiry was held by our ex-Chief Commissioner, Neil Comrie.
That's all?
And Neil Comrie, not surprisingly, I guess to some extent, identified a lot of the same things 18 months later the Royal Commission had identified. But he went further, and this might be difficult for you to see, so again I'll use a laser and
start from scratch.
and tried to put that in a graphic way so as people like me, picture people and not word people, actually get a better understanding of what he was talking about. And what this pinwheel is designed to show in effect is that...
Well, actually, your phone is like mine, right?
Laser goes to our guest. The mouse would.
Oh, okay, fine. I'll use the mouse then. Let's see if it will work from here. Yes,
It's
it
not
will.
hotspot.
So what Mr. Connery was saying was that between 1983, when our first legislation was enacted through 2009 and 10, we had, as agencies within our jurisdiction, believed in
So I can have internet down there.
emergency management in all hazards, all agencies' way. So therefore, we were considering all of our planning in a broad.
So I can do Justin Zone 2.
All agencies were integrated in the way that they responded to events. There was interoperability, etc., etc., etc. And our plans were not just hazard-specific, other than where they had to be, but they looked at the consequences of events and looked at how the system responds to the consequences.
Yeah, they gave the guys
Operational procedures.
some kind.
So that was what we're telling
Some
ourselves.
guys have that, but they're not doing that anymore.
I went to
You can use that anyway, right?
numerous presentations between 83 and 2009 where people talked about how Victoria practices all hazards, all agencies and emergency management. And Neil Connery was saying, well, we actually don't, and that was really quite clear. So, oh, yeah, okay.
But this will work almost the
So
same
the
way.
result of that, what he said was the 83 legislation
No,
we're working
They stop giving them before they go around to me.
effectively set up all these silos.
So that guy came from another branch,
On the outside,
and that's what they were using.
by name, you have
The conference has been muted.
Emergency Service, Victoria Police, and so it goes on, all our agencies. And that underneath each of those, there are a range of hazards that they are responsible for responding to and managing. And the legislation has set it up so you've got an agency and then you've got the hazards that they're responsible for managing. And the only thing that was actually done in an all agencies and cross agency way was the emergency response coordination part that was done by Victoria Police. Now, when it says emergency response coordination, that doesn't actually mean coordinating the activities of agencies to manage the event. All that means is that the Victoria Police were the agency that gathered resources from anywhere and everywhere to throw at the event to allow the control agency or the command agency, whatever you call it over here, to actually do the job. It wasn't about coordinating the activities of the agencies themselves. So even the title was a misnomer in relation to what that presented. And as a result of that, the difference between what we actually had on the outside of the pinwheel here and what we thought we had when we were talking about it in the middle here was a strategic void between the two that said that as a result of the existing legislation, we didn't have any enabling legislation in reality that actually made us or created an environment of all hazards for us, all hazards, all agencies practice for us. The legislation was so prescriptive that it actually forced you into silos. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Do you use an incident command system?
Yes, we do. Yeah.
So that kind of hopefully pushed that back a bit.
Yeah. As well as the enabling legislation, we had no strategic policy that actually then was enabled by that legislation that allowed us to work all the way across all of the agencies in that coordinated way. We had no interoperability between our systems and our procedures or otherwise, that they were all, again, agency specific, so therefore it was very difficult to have multiple agencies responding to one event working in a coordinated way. Our training and our exercising was done in a siloed way. Again, it was all about the hazards that the individual agencies were responsible for, so that's all they trained to, and it was rare for a fire service to conduct a large exercise where they would have a number of other agencies participate in that exercise with them to allow them to exercise their part of responding. So it was, again, agency-specific exercising. We had no common language, and this was really evident not only in 2009, but again in 2013 and 14, because it still hadn't been resolved, where we had more big fires, and we had public land fire agency and private land fire agency sitting side by side on a road between two fires, and the radios weren't common. They couldn't talk to each other on the radios between the two vehicles. Even if they could, the language that they used was totally different, so therefore if they were using their own language to talk to another fire agency, the other fire agency wouldn't actually understand what they were talking about because there was no consistency even between the title titles of the people on the vehicles or the responsibilities of the people on the vehicles, anything like that at all. So our whole issue of common language and interoperability between equipment and vehicles and communications and everything was part of that strategic void. And then at the bottom here, there's no standard or no standards, audit or overarching assurance mechanism across the system. All of the standards that existed were within the agencies and they were their specific standards that they were working to. There was nothing that sat across the top to make sure that the system itself was functioning in a collective way. And there was no capacity to audit these things other than where, you know, your standard debriefings occur after all the events. People talk about whatever, but there was no capacity for the system itself to audit right across the board. So they were the things that were considered to be missing in relation to Neil Cromrey's findings. And they, as I said, that supported a lot of what was found by the Royal Commission. So just looking from 2009 up to 1 July last year, where our new legislation kicked in, to give you a bit of a pictorial or a graphic of what we had our Royal Commission findings in July 2010, out of which came 67 recommendations. The government accepted all of those, and therefore they are progressively being implemented. We had also, just following that, the release of our National Strategy for Disaster Resilience, which is a federally coordinated strategy that all of the states and territories have signed up to, and there were many of the things that were in that national strategy that actually related quite closely to a number of the findings in the Royal Commission, so therefore it's an extremely relevant document in regard to the principles that sat within it. In December 2011, we had the flood review report released by Neil Cromrey, and with that came another 93 recommendations. So there's 150 recommendations before you 160 rather, before you go any further. As a result of those two reports at the top on the recommendations, the government decided that rather than, it would be dangerous to just make a government decision about what they were going to do about this, they actually needed to go out and consult with the Victorian community and ask them what they believed the issues were and how they believed the system could best be designed in a way that it would support communities when they were in times of extreme stress. So they went out and conducted a green paper process, which is a community consultation process. That was released in September 2011, the results of that and the findings of that green paper. Then between September 2011 and December 2012, the government and the policymakers sat down and wrote the Emergency Management Reform White Paper. And that white paper then identified exactly what the future of the system was going to be and how it would look. And an important part of that was the new legislation that is dated, it's the Emergency Management Act of 2013, but it was enabled on the 1st of July 2014. The interesting part about this legislation is that it hasn't completely repealed the existing 1986 legislation. So at the moment, we have two pieces of legislation sitting side by side. This piece in 2014 has only dealt with the governance structures, it's dealt with the operational structures, it's identified some new entities and closed down others and redesigned how the whole system looks. But as far as the actual functioning of the agencies at the moment, they are still working to the 1986 legislation, and one of the entities that's in this legislation here is called an Emergency Management Commissioner. And his function is to actually effectively bring all of those agencies together in the fire season and make sure that when we have a large emergency that they are all physically working together, because their own legislation still is the legislation that they have obligations to meet, because they're statutory agencies with individual legislation, and if they end up in a Royal Commission, the first thing they have to be able to defend is their statutory obligation. So, as I said, this deals with the structures at the moment, and progressively over the next 18 months, 2 years, the remaining parts of the 86 legislation will be repealed by amendment, and we'll end up with just the one act.
Two questions.
Yes, certainly.
Of the 160 recommendations,
Yep.
I'm assuming some were structural, some were community, and some were building code.
Yeah, all sorts of things, yeah, right across the board.
So the legislation that would have dealt with how many of the 160?
The legislation only deals with the emergency management sector elements of it. So those that apply to planning, those that apply to industry and so on, that legislation is all being amended as well to reflect those recommendations. So I was going to mention a little bit further on, but for example, our critical infrastructure legislation that was designed to protect critical infrastructure from terrorist type events and didn't take into account natural hazard events has now been rewritten, and it's at the final stages of the rewrite at the moment. And the critical infrastructure part's been taken out of our terrorism security legislation and built into its own, and that then takes care of natural hazards as well as the security hazards. So the issues, for example, that the power companies were involved in, and they were all declared essential services under our critical infrastructure legislation, but the industries and so on, and their obligations in emergency management are now dealt with in that new legislation. So there's a number of other pieces of legislation that are being addressed at the same time. The Emergency Management Act itself talks about the governance and the structures within the system, and it talks about the planning across emergency management, which includes industry and so on, and a number of other things, but it doesn't specifically tell other parts or other sectors how they should go about their part, but it certainly ties them in through the planning regime, though. Yeah. This slide here is it's a little bit of a sort of a flippant slide from my perspective. And I've referred to us along the way as the missing link, and the reason I say us, the Inspector General for Emergency Management, our office, the reason I call us the missing link is that in effect the legislation that I've just described to you in putting some new entities in place in some ways has done a lot of housekeeping. So we have, in that legislation now, we have an Emergency Management Commissioner. As I said, his responsibility is to bring together all of the operational agencies throughout the state and ensure that when we have a large emergency, they are all working together in a coordinated way. Now, all of those things existed before. The agencies were there, the work that they were required to do was there, the resources they had was there, but they were doing it in a sporadic, scattergun way. So in effect, the Emergency Management Commissioner is what I call a big housekeeping piece of work in pulling that all together and making sure that they all do function in that collective way. Emergency Management Victoria is the new state level emergency management body, and Emergency Management Victoria is all about policy. It's about interoperability in a procurement sense. It's about a whole range of things like that. It's about getting best bang for your buck in a collective way rather than allowing agencies to go out and do all their own thing as they see fit. So, for example, if one agency is working and spending millions of dollars on trying to put a new communication system together, if they think they have a need for that, then before they can do that now, they have to work with EMV, and EMV brings together all of the agencies across the state to find out what the state need is rather than just allowing one agency to go off, or as we often find out, in doing that, find out that one or two other agencies are looking at very similar systems but doing it in isolation on their own. So again, it's like a very big piece of housekeeping activity. It's pulling together and coordinating the activities in the policy sense, in the procurement sense, and a range of other type senses. And EMV provides corporate support to the Emergency Management Commissioner, so they enable him doing his business as well. The third part that came in was my office, the Inspector General for Emergency Management. And as I said to you before, there was actually no overarching assurance mechanism in place at all before. And even at agency level, the only activity really that was occurring in a considered way was the debriefings that occurred after events. And as a result of that, they would then identify some things that they wanted to resolve in their own right, and then agencies would go away and do that within their own agency. But there was nothing that was happening across the system where there was any sort of relationship between agencies where improvements should be identified that could actually be implemented that would actually allow the system to function better. So it was all about agencies improving themselves at agency level. So in effect, as I said, we're almost the missing link in that we're not tidying up something that already existed. It didn't exist at all before. I'll describe how we do it in a second. So within the legislation, there's a couple of objectives there. The two primary objectives at the top there about providing assurance and about fostering continuous improvement. And providing assurance is almost in the eye of the beholder as to what that actually means. And I've sort of gone to great pains to explain to the Victorian community that me providing assurance is not about me being able to come out to them and say, we will no longer have these sorts of events, or you will no longer be impacted by large emergencies. What assurance is about is saying that we will do everything we can to ensure that all of the elements of the emergency management system are working in such a way that the best that can be provided in the face of whatever it is that we're facing at the time will be provided. But you are still going to suffer big events, you are still going to suffer the impacts of them, and to differing degrees, we will have differing outcomes as a result of that. But the one thing that our assurance system should do is be able to make sure that as well as the system can work, it can. And when we have an event where there are failings, that the system is actually able to identify what those failings were, identify potential solutions to try and mitigate them occurring again, or at least mitigate the impacts of them occurring again, and then be able to put a process in place that says that we monitor the implementation of anything that comes out of there right through to the end, instead of the old way of just saying, well, here's some recommendations, no one takes any notice of them, and 5 years later it happens again. So assurance, that's the context of assurance. The functions at the bottom, there are actually 8 of them. I've only put those 2 there, and the reason for that is that the upper 6 pretty well dovetail in underneath these 2 anyway. The 2 biggest things we do, I guess, we are responsible for developing and maintaining a monitoring and assurance framework for the sector, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And we're also responsible for undertaking system-wide reviews, and there's a couple of ways in which we do those, which I'll say. The monitoring and assurance framework for emergency management. Our minister last Friday went to Cabinet. This framework went to Cabinet and was signed off by Cabinet, and our minister will be releasing it shortly publicly, and it'll go on our website once that's done. When you look at this, it's actually it's not rocket science. I look at it, I think it's about 18 pages in all. And when you read it, it's almost like, yeah, well, that makes perfect sense. Part of the benefit of having done this for us is that it's actually meant that in order to get the framework signed off, we had to get all of our departments and all of our agencies to endorse it. That was a 12-month process. When you look at what's in it, you say, how can it take you 12 months? Well, for those of you that have worked with multiple agencies and had to try and coerce and convince and take them on a journey, you know that it takes time. But the very fact that we did that and they endorsed it means that they're now obligated to it, and they have to meet the requirements that are inside it. We deliberately wrote it to be descriptive rather than prescriptive, so it doesn't actually prescribe how assurance is conducted. It describes assurance activities such as monitoring both performance and implementation. It describes evaluations, it describes reviews, it describes a number of other things, audits and so on. But it doesn't tell them how to specifically go away and do it. We have standards in Australia for a number of these things that they have to, that if you're conducting these activities, you would comply with those standards. But it describes the assurance environment. The other thing it does is it also, I guess, paints the picture and explains that the Inspector General for Emergency Management is not the only entity responsible for assurance. And the very first thing that happened when the new legislation came in is everyone said, oh, Jim, that's fantastic. And the minute someone talked about a review or an inquiry or something else, they tried to handball it across to us and say that we would be doing it. And my response back to that was that the fact that there's an IGEM in place doesn't allow an agency to abrogate its own responsibilities that it has within its agency to actually assure itself that it's functioning the best that it can. My job is to make sure that where all of those agencies are functioning like that, then the system itself is functioning at a high level in a very effective way. So it explains the different levels of assurance, and in one of those, that's where the agencies fit, so it actually articulates that clearly for them that they have a responsibility, and it's that type of a document, so it's descriptive rather than prescriptive.
So it's like an internal versus an external audit. You're external audit, but that means they shouldn't have internal audit.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, it means that they still have to have internal. That's exactly right. So it describes all of that, but then it describes the different processes and everything as well. And the thing that will follow, as I said, this will be released shortly in Victoria, and then there's a work to be done underneath in the development of what we call guidance notes that actually walks them through all of the processes, how each one of those is conducted, and then how it relates to each of the various levels of assurance that apply in the state in our system. So that's the first product, and that's probably one of the most important ones because it ties everything else up. The other thing that we have is in legislation is a requirement to have a forward plan of reviews. So I'm required each year to work with the sector to identify a number of, and it's not specified the number, this year it's 3, but it'll depend on how busy we are with other work each year as to how many there are. But to identify a forward look of particular issues that we're actually going out to deliberately review that haven't come about as a result of some sort of crisis, but that they're system level. So, for example, this year we're looking at 3. The first one is the community recovery progress against the 2013-14 fire season, because that was a particularly bad one. So we're looking at how the recovery system has worked and what the outcomes are that have been delivered as a result of that. We're looking at the government's capacity to respond to multiple or concurrent major emergencies, because had we had that particular event in the middle of some major public health issue, or had we had a significant security event occur at the same time as the fires were occurring, our departments and our secretaries of our departments are genuinely concerned that we may not have the ability to respond to concurrent events. And the third one that we're looking at is how the community is prepared to respond to large-scale events from their perspective, and how the emergency management systems provision of services to them is actually supporting them to do that. So they're 3 fairly big reviews. They're all underway at the moment. They all have to be completed by the end of the year, and each one of those will result in a report. And everything we do goes on our website, so it's publicly available. So anything that comes out of it, warts and all, goes up on the website, and the community has full access to those. The third thing that we do, that actually goes back to the question you asked me earlier on this morning, was we conduct reviews at the request of the Minister as well. So these can just be out of the blue. The Royal Commission, as one of its recommendations in trying to deal with the issue of fuel loads on public land, identified that there was that the current approach, or the approach in 2009, wasn't an effective one, and therefore there's a new strategy needed. This is one of the most emotional issues you can talk about in our state. We have 2 camps pretty well. One side of the fence says burn everything from east to west, and if you burn it all then you can't have a fire, so nobody suffers, so that's good. The other side, the environmental side, says you don't burn a leaf, and there are very few people sitting in between. The Royal Commission came up with a recommendation, and they, as I said, I had to speak to the Honourable Justice Teague, who was the head of the Commission, about the fact that I was doing this review. But our Minister asked me to do a review of prescribed burning on public land earlier this year, and to come back to government with a recommendation about how it should be done into the future. Well, the Royal Commission had already made a recommendation, and had already been implemented by government, which was to burn 5% of public land every year. That's it. So they had a fixed target of 5%. For our state, that came to about 295,000 hectares, I think it is, a year, had to be burnt. And our public land fire agency was out there doing its damnedest to burn 295,000 hectares a year. The problem with that, of course, is how do you measure the community safety benefits of doing that when there are so many variables that impact upon your capacity to burn? So the fire agency was getting hammered year in, year out since 2010, when they first started burning to that scale. They've not one year met the 5%. Not one year, no matter how hard they've tried, they couldn't get to 5% because of weather and because of a whole range of other things that prevent them from doing it. But what they were doing to do their best to do it was going out into areas where there was actually no community benefit whatsoever from burning. And if it was a day where they could burn, then burning as many thousands of hectares as they possibly could to try and meet the 5% target, which, as you can imagine, is doing significant damage to the environment in some places. So the government asked me to do this review. That is on our website now. That's just been published on our website just recently. And that now makes recommendations to government that they move from a hectare-based target to a risk reduction target. I won't go into the detail of how I got there. If you're interested, you can read the report, but it's a fairly complicated piece of work. But government is now consulting with the community about their views on our recommendations, and they will make a policy announcement probably in August or September saying that they've changed their policy and they are now going to targeted burning rather than fixed percentage burning.
Yes, so when we were exchanging earlier about the difference between an internal audit and an external audit,
yep,
and the role that you're playing to sort of give that external audit of the process of emergency management in Victoria. So my understanding of the technical elements, what does an audit actually mean in a government type context? So my understanding of what an audit means is that the government's made a policy choice. It's announced what the government would like to achieve. And then the question is, are the different agencies actually working to achieve that goal? Are they implementing? Are they doing it? Yeah. Do they have enough resources to get it? And a number of things show up in an audit. But it's not meant to go back and question did the government make the right policy choice.
No. Whereas,
so this last example was a different responsibility for you, asking you to do something that was not purely an audit question. You've now been given a policy question. Right? So that interesting. The other parts, I think, were relatively straightforward.
Yeah.
The
legislation is written in such a way that it actually one part of it talks about conducting reviews. So they would say this is not an audit; it's a review of existing practice, and then for me to make a judgment on whether that practice is actually relevant today or not. And it's actually written in the legislation in a way that allows the minister to do that. So it is interesting, but they've been very creative in the way that they've written it.
Yeah, if you want to be creative, I mean, the goal always was to reduce risk.
Yep.
And they wrote it as achieve a percentage area burn, right?
Yeah.
And so it could be defined as a clarification of achieving what they really meant.
Yeah.
But
and look, and when I went back and spoke to Justice Teague, obviously I had to make sure he understood what I was doing because I had a pretty good idea I was going to make a recommendation that was different to the Royal Commission, and so I wanted to make sure that he understood that when I was doing that my approach in doing that was to always aim to meet the intent of his recommendation, not necessarily to get there in the same way that he did. So I needed to clarify, make sure I understood what the intent was, which I did, so that was fine, which was about. It was actually about preserving life and property, and life being at the top. That was really the bottom line of what it was. So I said any recommendation I make would be aimed at meeting the intent of it, and also that when I wrote up in the report, I would also make it clear in the way that I wrote the report that we weren't actually criticising the Royal Commission in any way, shape, or form. The decisions they made in 2009-10 were based on the advice they had and what was available to them at the time, and technology and everything else. We're 6 years on from then. Things change. And that's one of the failings that we had from 1983 to 2009 was we hadn't kept up with that change. So I also wanted them to understand that we would make sure that we painted the picture to say that this was all about meeting the intent.
A bit more in the same area, though. You were sharing earlier that part of the government's intent, part of setting up your agency, your brand new unique agency, was to be prescriptive.
No, the framework was descriptive rather than prescriptive.
But not prescriptive.
Yep.
The illustration you're using here is one that was prescriptive, burn 5%.
That was the Royal Commission. Yeah.
So it's my understanding that in Canada, a number of different agencies are getting into not the exact space you are, because it is absolutely unique what you're doing, but this idea of metrics.
Yep.
So how do we give assurance to the public? Well, we have these measurements, and the measurements are moving at this pace, which sounds a bit prescriptive.
Yeah.
Right? What do you have to do to meet those measurement goals? Anyway, to what extent is some of your work specific measures?
Well, as far as we talk about the sorts of things that we're looking at, where we're monitoring, if we're monitoring recommendations that have already been made, then they are what they are. When we conduct our evaluations and reviews into processes, and we change the process, we logic map the process to actually identify what all of the key elements of it are. And then once we've done that, we then define and work with the agency students and get agreement on what are the defined outcome measures in relation to the outcomes that they're trying to achieve. And then there are very often metrics against those. And then we monitor then against those outcome measures. That's what we're measuring, are the agreed measures that we've come up with between us in relation to those. So some of them have figures, some of them have other types of metrics to them, but there is still measurement in there. But as far as the framework goes, we don't talk about we don't prescribe what the measures should be or otherwise. That's what comes out of the logic mapping process that they conduct then, where you identify your outcomes and your outcome measures.
I find the ecosystem arguments very, very interesting because here in Canada, it's almost the same hazard that you're dealing with, but a lot of and I'm not sure if it's the same there, but here, fire is part of the ecosystem.
Yes. Yep.
If you stop the fires, you create this huge fire later, and it burns so hot that it actually destroys the pine cones, because normally you fire to have the pine cones open and seed themselves. So by protecting the ecosystem, you can end up destroying the ecosystem. So there's this really sort of balance you have to take, plus the forestry industry, which is going to be pulling, essentially pulp and paper and various other, final products and whatever out of there. So you end up with this real knife edge that you end up trying to balance on, and it looks like you're having sort of a similar thing.
Well, as has been to say that you've just described our environment. That's no different at all. And you've described, and by doing that, you then articulate almost where the camps are as to where people sit in relation to their views on it. But if you look, our website is, if anyone's interested in it, is www.vic.gov.au. If you go to that, you'll actually find a link to this review of performance targets for bushfire fuel management. The reason the report itself is not on my website is because I did that independently for government. I've given it to them as theirs, therefore it doesn't sit on my website, but there is a link that will take you to it. And then if you want to have a look at that, that talks about the community involvement, it talks about science involvement, it talks about a whole range of other things as well that contribute to how you then can ascertain what the risk reduction benefit is and what the potential impacts of it are as well. So that gives you a bit better an idea. It'll also take you to the agency who actually is responsible for all of that anyway, so therefore you might find some more interesting stuff on there in relation to what you've just been talking about. So if you follow that link, once you get there, you'll be able to see a bit more in detail. Right, 15 minutes. We're nearly there anyway. One of the other things that we did, and I'll use this mouse again, there it is, yeah. One of the other things we've done is we've almost, I'm sure everyone's sort of aware of the single loop, double loop learning processes that are described. Well, when I was thinking about how we conduct our reviews and so on and our assurance activities, it occurred to me that it was much in line with that concept of single loop, double loop learning. In other words, we have events, historically we have events and hazards that we are well aware of, and as a result of that, we identify a whole range of emergency management functions and activities and response process and everything that we put in place to be able to deal with those events. Then the event occurs, and as a result of that, we deploy all of these things. And when the event's over, we then review our activities, particularly where we get a sense that maybe it didn't go quite as well as it could have done. And when we do that, we look at the implementation quality of those strategies and so on that we put in place. We look at the status of them to see if they were actually fully developed and when they were utilised. And that's the what we do bit, which is over here. We also look at system performance and also the outcomes that were achieved by deploying those activities and those functions. And if we find that they didn't work well, what we tended to do was to go straight back to the functions themselves again and either spend more money on them or something like that, or redesign them or otherwise, and then go through the whole process again of doing the same thing over. Then it doesn't go so well again maybe, and we go back through that process just to the functions, we reboot them, we put some more money in them, and we do it over and over and over and over. And it's almost like going, walking through a door, getting hit in the head with a brick, doing it 3 times and not realising if you walk through a 4th time you're going to get hit in the head with a brick. So we kept doing that over and over and over again, and that's what the Royal Commission was saying in that first comment that they made, that I had on that earlier slide. So what we do now is, through that assurance framework that we've developed and through our practice in the Office of IAEM, we now make sure that as we get to the end part of this and we realise that things didn't get so well, we go back here now and we actually review the assumptions that we've been making and we test those assumptions because, as I said, if you think again to 2009 when the Royal Commission handed its findings down to 2015, I've now made alternative recommendations to the ones that they made in relation to that prescribed burning. That's because the environment's changed and things have changed. Technology has got better. The capacity of the fuel management or the land management agency is far better than it was to be able to go out and take a risk approach to burning on public land rather than the targeted hectare-based approach. So what we do now is say that in all of the ways that we go about our business, we should always go back to the first base, not the second. And the first base is go back and reassess and test your assumptions, because those assumptions may not be valid any longer. But we were always failing to go back and do that. So we just assumed that because we've always done it this way, that we just spend a bit more money on it and eventually we're going to catch up and it'll all be good. But very often what we find now is that, as I said, those assumptions are not right, that something has changed in the community sense, something has changed in an environmental sense or something else, and that without recognising that and building it into your activities and your functions, then you're doomed to keep doing the same thing over and over and over again.
This is very interesting to me because in every report or post-action report I've read, there's always lessons learned.
Yeah, well,
and that usually turns into damn stupid mistakes we'll make again. This basically gets around this and forces people to look at those lessons learned and actually do something with it. So it would be something actually I'd recommend at a corporate level and the risk assessment level in my own business, that you build this into your audit function, both internal and external.
yeah. And in fact, if I'll jump this next slide. That's just talking about some work that we're doing. I'll just pop these ones up here, recognising we're almost out of time. This, I guess, is what has changed today. These are the things that have changed between the Royal Commission and now. Our government, when they released the Royal Commission findings, said that the reform journey is a 10-year journey. They said, look at 10 years before we can get the whole of those recommendations and the implications of all of those firmly embedded into our practice. So it's not something that happens very, very quickly. On the next slide, there are a number of things that are still occurring and will continue to occur over a period of time. But if we get to what you were just talking about a second ago, which will be on the last slide, I'll talk about a little bit about what you were saying a second ago. There are a number of implementation challenges, as you can imagine. I mean, the sector culture itself is a huge issue in itself. These agencies, as all of yours are, your fire agencies and your police force and everything particularly, they are two particular groups who have strong, long-standing cultures. And if you're looking at changing the way in which those types of agencies go about doing their business, it's not a simple case of going and saying you will change. That doesn't happen. So a lot of the work that we've done over the last 12 months has been about getting them on board, getting them to understand the benefits of it, getting them to want to change, and then taking them with us on the journey. And that's why I actually think that the worst thing our government did was call me an Inspector General, because the implications in Australia of an Inspector General normally, if you hear one is coming, is that you batten down the hatches and you go into defensive mode and you get ready to fight. Whereas that's not what I do. And I'm not about finding fault. I'm not about finding the guilty party. What I am about doing is saying, okay, well, if this didn't work out well in this event, what do we need to do collectively to make sure it works out better in the next one? Rather than to say, you're a fault, you're a fault. There are other mechanisms in our law that allow that to happen, so that's not what I'm about. So that's a big part of what we're doing. Political continuity can be a real issue. One government can implement all of this stuff, another one can take it away just as quickly. We're lucky in that we've had a change of government since this all started, and they've maintained the reform program to exactly the same degree as the former government did, which is good. They'd want to come up with a pretty good alternative, I guess, if they were going to change it. But of course, this costs money, it's not cheap, and therefore governments are always looking at how to save money, and if you have a bit of a quiet period, they tend to start stripping it out of our sector, as I'm sure they do yours. So you've always got that risk about continuity. Community and agency readiness for this. The community's certainly ready, but they're only ready in certain pockets. Generally those that actually experience emergencies on a fairly regular basis, but in areas where they don't, you can't just simply apply this sort of a reform in pockets throughout the state. You either do it or you don't. So it's easier in some areas than others to get the community involved and to get them engaged and to get them to actually recognise that they play a part in this and they have some ownership of this as well. So therefore it's not all about government coming to do it for you. Guess what? We can do this much, but you have to be able to do this much, and we will help you to be able to get there. So there's a fair bit of work that's going on in that space. Resources are a problem. As I said, if the government thought for 1 minute that by putting this reform program in place it would save them any money, they're kidding themselves. It's actually going to cost them plenty. So therefore that's always a problem. Managing expectations, both from the political side as well as the community side, is a problem. And interdependencies. Still we have issues where agencies or government departments don't realise that decisions that they make today are going to have knock-on effects to others that will actually ultimately impact negatively on the decision that they're trying to get an improvement out of. So this whole issue of interdependencies and getting government agencies and government departments to understand how the decisions they make impact on each other. Time is a problem because it's going to take us a long time to get it done, and if we have quiet periods, if we have very busy periods of activity, that detracts and takes you away from trying to do the reform stuff because the sector is actually out there responding to emergencies. And then that's where you're talking about at the top. So what we're saying is that we think very effectively through the Royal Commission, through the Comrie inquiry and through the processes that have been put in place since both of those, that we have identified a lot of the lessons out there. Not all of them, because we'll continue to have issues occur where things pop up that we just hadn't anticipated, but we have certainly identified a lot of lessons. We've only only learned some of them because we've actually been able to put things in place to address those, so we would consider those to be learned, but a lot of what we've identified still hasn't been fully addressed, so we would say it's still lessons identified and we haven't translated those into lessons learned yet. But we're getting there, and I'm with you. We practice this whole thing of, lessons identified are very different to those that you've learned, so that's how we think about it. What we've put in place is about sustainable and measurable change. It's not ad hoc, and it's not simply putting reforms in place, moment-in-time reform as we've done in the past, and Ash Wednesday and so on. This is now being monitored and it's being measured and it's sustainable, so therefore we will see it through to the end. To add monitoring for intent, my office is there to actually monitor all of these recommendations and all of these changes, and I report to Cabinet once or twice a year, depending on what the issue is, about the progress on every single recommendation from every single review. As to where that's at, those that are still valid. It's about system level continuous improvement, as I said. We've moved from an activity focus to an outcome focus, so all of the reviews and the inquiries and the evaluations that we do now produce outcomes, and from those outcomes we identify outcome measures and then we measure against those. So it's not just about activity anymore, because when it was just about activity we were doing the same thing over and over again for no good outcome. It's about shared responsibility. We've now spent years, the last few years, working with the community to get them to understand that it's about them. The private sector, it's about them. It's about government. It's about the not-for-profits, and they're all involved. And at the state level, industry's represented, local governments represented, not-for-profits are represented at our state level committee structures. So they're actually involved in the development of our ongoing state policy. Our strategic void is closing. It's not closed yet because a number of the things haven't been fully implemented, as I said, but we are well on the way to closing the void. And finally, it's a long road. As I said, it will take a long time. The Royal Commission finished in 2010. We're 2015 now, and I would say we probably are about halfway there. We've still got a long way to go. I describe it almost as like beauty, skin deep. On the outside, if you look at it, you'll see new structures, you'll see new uniforms in the Emergency Management Commissioner's office, you'll see the Inspector General coming to talk to you and that sort of stuff. Well, that tells you that things have changed. But below that, at the next level down, at the regional level, we are still getting those guys to accept and understand and to identify where they fit into this so they can then be the next advocate for it to drive it down to the local level. And the closer you get to the ground, the less you can see the change. So there's still a lot of work to be done to be able to drive that fully down, but we're well on our way, and we've got no doubt we're going to get there, but that's where it is. And Paul, that's about the guts of it, as we say in Australia.
We've got another 5 minutes.
Yeah, Tony, your responsibility, is it strictly in Victoria or is it more encompassing of Australia?
Only in Victoria. Queensland has, up to the north of us, Queensland has also put the same office, same title in place. And the reason for doing that was their state premier looked at it and said, well, there, but for the grace of God, go us. And if they've already been through this, let's just pretend that we have or we could, and let's have a look at how many of those recommendations are valid here, and we'll implement them as well. And one of them was to put an IGEM in place. So there's only 2 states have them.
And are they then training their people to use the same terminology that you standardise on?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Hopefully there might be some communication.
Yeah, very similar sort of work. And Ian's office and my office, our teams even have regular monthly phone hookups to talk to each other about what they're doing, what we're doing, what are we thinking, etc., and what are we seeing. Because the other thing, of course, that happens is you've got 6 other states and territories out there that are watching what we're doing that haven't put anything like this in place yet, but very likely will do some sort of assurance mechanism. And if you had yourself doing very similar work, expected to deliver very similar outcomes, and then arriving at poles apart places, that would send a pretty bad message. And it would also mean either one of us wasn't doing it right, or collectively we weren't doing it right. So we maintain a very close sort of touch base with each other as well.
So is the hazard of wildfire consistent throughout Australia, or is it more?
No, it's New South Wales just above us. Southern Queensland gets a bit, but New South Wales above us, ourselves, Tasmania and South Australia, they're probably the 4 worst. And then the hazard above really for Queensland is predominantly major flooding and cyclones. Western Australia is cyclones, they have wildfires as well, but cyclones is their really big one. And the Northern Territory is cyclones and major flooding. So flooding and cyclones up the top, fire up the bottom pretty well.
I noticed you were talking about shared responsibility, especially the sort of citizens and business. Are business being asked to do business continuity plans? Are you bringing them into your exercise?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so there's a very well defined business continuity process for business and its relationship with government, and they exercise with us and they train with us, and they sit on. We have what we call a trusted information sharing network. It's called, and that was actually born of terrorism, and it's a national arrangement where there are a number of sectors that are identified as being critical at the national level, but industry is actually the chair of the national group for that. So we've actually given some of the responsibility to them and let them chair those as well. There's about 7 sectors in all that are looked at, but that trusting, again, if you type in Trusted Information Sharing Network, that'll give you an idea of how that works. Yeah.
Because we're trying to work towards that in Canada. I know the Americans have it, but we've had some exercises. Quite often they're, believe it or not, pushed by the private sector, but there's still a lot of work to do to get these groups.
I know the Canadian government, Australian, the US, and the UK government have all worked together on this. So the TISM that I'm talking about, I think it was born of terrorism. The TISM is well known in Canadian government as well, but how they're using it is separate in every story. And also, much like us, how far down the chain it goes where people actually know about it and understand what it's doing is also, that differs as well. So, there could be things functioning here that you're even not aware of until you go and make an inquiry, because no one's just passing that down. We have that all the time.
You've been able to share with us the significant reforms taking place at the Victoria state level. How about at the national level and at the local level? What kind of responses come at those levels? Are they really trying to change?
Well, the local level is actually a part of our internal state structure. So local government is actually a part of what I've described there. They're actually implicitly built into that. The national level is different in that, as I said before, because they don't have a mandate, but they have an interest in national consistency. They're observing what we're doing in Victoria, and also, of course, with the IAEM in Queensland to see what they're doing. And I would guess that from their perspective, if they can see the value of it, they're certainly looking to take out of what they can to be able to get more and better information out of Victoria. So they're looking to take. But if they could see some benefit in the national context, then they would have a look at something like that. But having spoken to the Attorney General's Department up there only a couple of weeks ago about what we're doing, they said, this concept is great, and we would love to come back and up here. But to try and do that across 11 federal government departments is unlikely that they would ever achieve it. As I said to them, even within the Attorney General's Department, if they've got border security and they've got emergency management and they've got a whole range of other things that fit within the national security crisis management arena, that even within their department they could put a mechanism in place within their department if they wanted to that would have the same impact that ours has had. So I don't know, it'll be interesting to see what they do, if anything.
When you were sharing that, for me, very powerful image of what people thought was happening and then what was actually happening and the void in between. If you could focus just on the part between what is being done at the Victoria's level and what's being done at the local government level, which, as you said, are all closely intertwined. But is there a sense that there's a change in the expectations of what is best done at the local level and what's best done at the state level?
Yeah, one of the things about local level is that they've always focused. They focused on specific hazards, and what the state has done. They said, we think fire is our biggest issue, or flood is our biggest issue, and they've worked on those things, and they've done that almost in isolation of the state to some extent. The state has now gone through. Well, there was a national exercise of conducting a national risk assessment. And then each jurisdiction, each state and territory did its own state and territory assessment to identify the whatever number, and we came up with 15 in Victoria. 3 of them are terrorism related, so they don't appear in the actual document that's on the web. But the other 12 are predominantly natural hazard or infrastructure, non-terrorism related infrastructure emergencies. That's now being rolled out. That's been signed off by the state government, by the Premier, as being the official risk register for the state. That's now been rolled out right across the state, down and through local government. They're now conducting local level risk assessments against that to identify which of those, instead of saying, it's fire because we see fire a lot, so therefore we forget about infrastructure, we forget about other things, and focus and plan only at the local level on that. They're actually assessing at local level now to identify which of those are actually relevant to their area. And then there's an emergency management planning committee that involves the local level and the state, where they are looking at their planning process for addressing those risks, not just based necessarily on the specific hazard. So that's the sort of work that hasn't gone on in the past, where they are now integrated in and doing that, and the state is facilitating assistance out. So the state has, in the local areas, has actually appointed a number of staff that work out in the local area to assist local government to go through those sorts of processes. Yeah.
One other that's been on my mind is, as we explored very briefly, from the private insurance industry point of view, a fire is a fire. It doesn't matter whether it's a brush fire. It doesn't matter necessarily why it started. You help insurance companies there to help the property owner.
Now you can ask me, but what about flood?
No, actually, I think with fire here.
Okay, that's all right.
But in response, there's an urban fire response.
Yep.
And there's a brush fire, wildfire response. And there's a sense within the response community, you need different skills, you need different kinds of people, or whatever. Certainly in Canada. Stephen Pine in the U.S. has written fairly extensively about what he sees as quite a big difference between urban fire and wildfire in the United States context in particular. And sort of two different communities have built up around how to deal with urban fire, how to deal with wildfire. And then you've got the interface, and neither one is particularly effective sometimes on these fringe communities.
Yeah.
In Australia, is there a sense that there's two completely different communities, or is it coming together? Is there some...
No, there is from a community perspective and from an agency perspective to some extent. I mean, you know, your Metropolitan Fire Brigade in Melbourne, for example, is all about urban fire. That's what they do. However, the last 4 years has seen a policy shift in that now it used to be that on the urban fringe you might get the Metropolitan Fire Brigade going out and working with the Country Fire Authority just on that urban fringe, and when they did, they only worked on putting houses out or buildings out. So they go and provide support for big factory fires and those sorts of things. Now they go out, because they're now trained as part of this state all hazards approach, they're now trained even as urban firefighters on stations that are on the outer side of the Melbourne metropolitan area to fight grass fires and wildfires as well. So, and even the urban fire brigades have actually even bought some rural fire tankers and badged them all up in their normal urban livery, and they sit out at those slightly further out stations as well, where they have firefighters that train in both structure fire as well as wildfire as well. So effectively, from the middle of Melbourne right the way out to the end of the state now, we have a response capacity across both of those services to go right across the whole spectrum. So that's working. From an insurer's perspective, from a fire perspective, we have what we call a fire services levy that is now applied right across the state. So everybody who has any sort of property pays I can't remember how much it is, but pays a certain amount per year as a fire services levy that goes towards funding the fire services. And part of that has been to actually get that cross-training and the additional equipment and everything in place to be able to do it. So that's, and the fire services levy has been in place for quite a number of years.
Okay. I'm watching the time. So we have used the time. Was there a last question before I close things down?